Hello and welcome to this fourth session on our series in government performance management. I'm absolutely delighted that you were able to join us once again. We are very rapidly approaching the midpoint of this series, and therefore it may be a good time to recap where we want to go, how far we have come, and what's the next step. And there is nothing better for that than to remind ourselves what was our original plan. This series will answer 4 key questions that would be of central concern to those interested in this topic of government performance management. First, what is the main problem that we are trying to solve? What are the leading approaches to finding a solution based on management theory and management practice? What are best practice effective methodologies that can be used? What is finally a practical way of implementing these best practice methodologies? That indeed is the unique selling proposition of this series, that it talks about how to convert theory into action and vision into results. So that was our plan. Let us therefore see what we said last time that will remind us how far we have come. Now, it's clear that governments are complex, multi-layered organizations, and therefore their efficiency and effectiveness have many dimensions. But this complexity and this diversity obscures 3 key facts. First, there are few underlying causes, and we've already discussed 2 of them in our previous 2 sessions. First being that you have a situation of multiple principles with multiple objectives which are often conflicting, and as a result, the managers and the officers do not know what is really expected from them. They have fuzziness as far as their goals and objectives are concerned. And if, as I said, if you do not know which race you are running, you're not likely to win that race. The second problem is the not me syndrome, that government officials try to pass the buck on to someone else, and this passing of the buck or responsibility is yet another problem. Now, the second point we must note, though we have diversity, the causes are similar across nations. So you'll find that they manifest themselves in different ways, but at the bottom, the underlying causes are pretty much the same. And finally, we have discussed that countries have dealt with these causes using remarkably similar approaches. And therefore, you can find that effective governments tend to have certain common strategies for dealing with these problems. We call them the 9 habits of an effective government. So let's get started. Last time, if you remembered, we said what gets measured gets done. But it would be more appropriate to say what gets measured properly gets done. Because if you do not measure it properly, you will not get it done. Or you will get done something that you are measuring. But if it's not measuring the proper thing, you'll not get the proper thing done. Therefore, it is very important to measure it properly. What do we mean by that? We gave the example that monitoring is not evaluation. Monitoring looks at the process of getting to where we want to be. But that's not important. It's like saying that we had a perfect operation, but the patient is dead. What good is the operation? And therefore, we need to focus on the end point, that is the evaluation. And monitoring is important to get us there, but to know whether we have reached the end point, we must do evaluation. Now, we said last time that evaluation is not new to the government. Governments have been doing evaluation for a long time. They started by looking at budget, whether you spend the money or not, and quickly they realized that's not enough, so they moved to performance budget, added some inputs and activities and outputs, but then they realized that's not enough, so they moved on to outcome budgets, and then finally the best practice where the governments are, the cutting edge governments, they call it commitment for results by many names, but that or performance agreement is the generic name for this approach. Now, when you compare performance agreements with the rest of the systems, the rest of the 3 systems, the budget, the performance budget, and the outcome budget, suffered from three fatal flaws. First of all, when you look at it, in all the three systems, the objectives are not prioritized. And we discussed that if things are not prioritized, then at the end you do not know whether the important things got done or the less important things got done. So if you do not have prioritization of your objectives, then I'm afraid it's a non-starter. So the performance agreement, or the CFR, which is another generic name, the commitment for results, that includes prioritization, and that's how it is different from the previous approaches, and that's why it represents progression. The second problem was that even the success indicators were not prioritized. So if you have the key performance indicators and 3-4 of them to measure the same thing, because often you require 3 or 4 ways to measure the same thing to get the holistic measure. For instance, if you're building a road, you need to know whether you meet the cost, whether it's on time, whether it has the right quality. And unless you measure all these dimensions, you're not measuring it properly. But if you're measuring it, all these dimensions, and there could be many more, there could be customer satisfaction. In that case, you need to prioritize these. Are these equally important? If they are, you must explicitly say they are equally important. If they are not, if one is more important than the other, then you must prioritize even the success indicators. And I'm afraid the previous 3 approaches did not prioritize, and therefore they have not worked, because without that, you can again get the easy stuff done and not what really matters. And finally, of course, that deviations. It's very important. The previous 3 approaches, that is the budget, the performance budget, and the outcome budgets, also did not measure the deviation. So they would give you a single point target. As I mentioned, if you have to build 700 kilometers of road, but if you build less than that, then these systems could only describe it, and there was no real measure. And that is another improvement which performance agreement and this commitment for results brings in. Now let's look at another dimension of evaluation. So far we have looked at how to evaluate. In a sense, if you have the indicators, what is the right way, you must prioritize them, you must have a deviation. But now the other dimension is whether you're measuring the right thing at all, because there are lots of types of evaluation, and you'll be surprised that in the name of evaluation, anything goes. So we must know whether we are measuring we're using the right evaluation technique. There are 3 main dimensions in which all evaluation techniques can be classified. First, most of them can be classified whether they are ex ante or ex post. Ex ante evaluation exercises basically give you, before the beginning of the year, a target or a thing to do and measure you accordingly. So it's management by objectives, and that's called ex ante because it was given to you and you knew what you were supposed to do. Ex post is what researchers do at the end, which is after the fact. Sometimes when the horses have left, they come after many years and they do this analysis without knowing what the managers were told. So that's an ex post analysis. Then there is another dimension, which is the dimension which measures whether it's the managerial performance or organizational performance or agency performance. These are 2 very different things. Now, because of COVID, many government departments will not be able to do what they were supposed to do. But that doesn't mean that it was managers' fault. And therefore, you have to take out exogenous divine interventions and then measure the contribution made by managers, and that's called managerial performance. The third dimension is whether you're measuring one aspect of the departmental performance or all aspects. And I submit that if you measure one aspect, that will surely get done, but the inefficiency in the department will get traveled to the other parts and the country will not be well served. So you make a difference between partial versus comprehensive approaches to evaluation. When you put all of these together, you get 8 basic cases. And really the most appropriate case is when you're measuring ex ante, that is, you're telling the managers in a fair way that this is what is expected from them. Second, it is comprehensive, so you're looking at all aspects of government performance, and that's where the budget and even the performance budget and outcome budgets did not measure up because they were only measuring partial indicators and the partial aspects of government performance. And of course, the final thing is that you have to also look at managerial performance and not organizational performance, because you're trying to change the managerial behavior. So that's why it's important. So the upper left-hand corner, which is marked as 1, is the relevant criteria. That's the relevant. And there are others which are all very legitimate studies. It's not to say they're not legitimate or they're not useful, but they're useful for some other purpose. For government performance management, only things falling under cell 1 are the most relevant approaches for measuring government performance. And we will see when we come to country applications, we will recall this discussion and try to judge how countries are doing, whether they measure up to the theory. Thank you. Some of you have asked me for some books that you could read along with these videos. There are many books, but I would give a few and perhaps send you via email many more. The first I would suggest would be a book which was custom made for the series, that is called Primer for Government Performance Management, and it's a primer for leaders in the government. So it's written in a style that is very readable. Everything that I have said is documented there, and this book was published by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Then you must get hold of some of the classics in government performance management. My all-time favorite remains, of course, Banishing Bureaucracy by David Osborne, and also its precursor, which was Reinventing the Government by Ted Gabler and David Osborne, which really started this whole movement of reinventing the government. In addition, I find the entire range of documents produced during the National Performance Review by the Clinton administration was fantastic. We will be talking much more about it in a later video with the person who was involved with making and writing many of these documents for the National Performance Review, Mr. John Kamensky, and we will have much more to add at that point. Now, before I put all this together, let me answer two questions that some of you have sent. One, that what is an economist doing with performance management and public administration, and why have I made this a big cause in my career? And the answer is threefold. There are three things that explain. First is, as a teaching, preaching economist, which I was and I still am, I continue to teach economics and even preach economics, and economic development is where I specialized. I realized very early on, having worked with the World Bank and other places, that it wasn't development theory that was lacking. Most of the finance ministers and the ministers for economy and planning were smart people. They were reading the same books and watching the same news, and they knew what to do. It was getting things done. So therefore, I realized that if I continue to focus on theory of development is not likely to take place unless I also complement with theory of implementation. So that was the first. The second reason was, very early on, when I returned back after doing my master's from the London School of Economics, and I joined St. Stephen's College here in Delhi University as a faculty member, and I started teaching. I was very excited. I thought this was the end of everything that I wanted, and I was very happy. So I used to get up early, prepare for the lectures, show up in time, and spend time with the students during the office hours. But some of my colleagues really asked me, what's wrong with me? And, why can't I take it easy? And I said, no, this is the way I've been trained. And in fact, I was trained and inspired to teach by my teacher, Amartya Sen. So no less a person. And he was an amazing teacher who really got me into the teaching field. But some of my colleagues said, look, that's different. In the West, you have to do this because you need to get a tenure. Here in India, the day you join, pretty much it's a tenured job. So you don't really need to go crazy. And therefore, I realized, and very soon my behavior started to change. Till I went back to Boston University to do my PhD, and there I realized on the very first day, the chair called me to his room and said, Praja, you're going to be a senior teaching fellow, and this is for 3 months. We are going to extend it depending on your performance. And he gave me the evaluation sheet that he is going to look, and the students are going to evaluate whether I have a complete grasp over the subject, whether I am able to convey the matter to them clearly. And I was really shocked. It was a cultural shock. Here I was used to teaching in the best college, and I was just having a great time, but there was no culture of evaluation. And so that changed me, and that changed my teaching. And that was the second big reason why I got convinced that what gets measured gets done, because it really improved my teaching. When I knew what was expected from me, I delivered. And the third was, and that's really the most important milestone in my life in making me move in this direction, that was, I was halfway through my PhD in Boston University, and my supervisor was Professor Leroy P. Jones. He was from Harvard, and he continued to teach at Harvard, and he was a world authority on public enterprises. There was no one close to him. In fact, I did well. That's another story because of him. And he was truly, he changed my life. So one day he called everyone. We were about 10 students who were doing PhD under his supervision. And he said, look, I'm planning to take some time off, and I teach this course at Harvard, and any one of you could teach. You have reached that point that this is not rocket science. You could teach. This is economics, and it was applied economics, but you can all teach. All 10 of you are qualified. But I am going to recommend my replacement at Harvard based on your performance. Whoever gets the best teaching evaluation this semester will get my nomination and my recommendation to Harvard for teaching my course. And boy, that really was another turning point. I mean, I was already used to evaluation, but this incentive that you could be teaching at Harvard really got us all charged up. All 10, 12 of us tried, did research what teaching is and wanted to be the best. But fortunately, that semester, by the second decimal point, I was ahead of everyone. And so, we go for a meeting, and Professor Jones looks at it and he said, well, guess what? Praja is ahead of everyone. So I guess it will be Praja, and that's it. He didn't care about anything. And he recommended my name, and the rest is history. Now, since 1979 till today, I continue to teach at the Kennedy School of Government. And that really convinced me that what gets measured gets done, the importance of measuring the right thing and the importance of measuring it. And now let's look at another dimension of measuring it properly. What does it really mean? But let me submit to you that when in the private sector, a company says they have made $300 million of profit, we tend to believe it. Investors believe it. The stock market responds accordingly because they believe it. And why do they believe it? Because $300 million profit was not arrived casually. There is a methodology for doing it, and it's known as generally accepted accounting principles. And it's not just that these accounts were prepared using the generally accepted accounting principles. Indeed, what else was done was they were audited by a third party, an external auditor, who also uses generally accepted accounting principles and certifies that these accounts were prepared using the generally accepted accounting principles or the GAAP principles, and therefore one can trust them. Unfortunately, that is missing in the government. There is no generally accepted performance methodology. But that has to change. And now there is an emerging consensus. There is a right way to do it, and there is a wrong way to do it. And now let me tell you what we consider to be the right way to do it. And I'm open to discussion, will be discussing with you if you have ideas on improving it. But I'm submitting, after 30 years of discussing with everyone, following would be the 4 or 5 steps you would take to measure government performance. Before we talk about the best practice methodology, let me talk about a very important part of this evaluation. Evaluation is no substitute for strategy. In fact, the first thing is that you must be clear about your objectives, your goals, your end. What's the end of your journey? To get to that end point, of course, you have several choices. It's rare that there's only one way to go there. If that's the case, then it's much easier. But in the real world, most of the time, to achieve any objective, to get to any destination, there are a few choices. These are called strategic choices. And the fact that you've chosen one of them shows that you have done some strategic thinking, that you have a strategy. And the way you arrive at your destination is by looking at what is called the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And then you come to a conclusion that one of the three options is the best for you, and you choose that. So that's a requirement. As Alice in the Wonderland said, that if you don't know where you're going, any path will lead you there. So you must know where you are going. Evaluation will not take you unless you know where you're going. So you must know what is the right thing to do. And as I said, then evaluation focuses on how to do it right. Make sure that you reach your end point quickly, efficiently, and in the least cost manner. So now let's talk about the best practice methodology. There are 4 steps to it. 3 of them are taken at the beginning of the year and the 4th one at the end of the year. And you must focus on it because this captures the essence of what we mean by proper evaluation. The first step is regarding choosing criteria or key success indicators or key performance indicators. Now, most governments do that. That's not a big deal. We've had evaluations ever since we have had governments and also planning departments in many countries. So they have a large number of key performance indicators. The problem is that these key performance indicators or success indicators are not prioritized. So at the end of the year, if you have done 2 of the less important ones and you didn't do the most important task, then how are we to evaluate? Therefore, prioritization is an extremely important part of evaluation. And that is the second step. In the second step, you attach weights, which is just another fancy way of saying you prioritize your objectives. You don't have to be accurate to the second decimal place. These are orders of magnitude. The first one is much more important than the 2 that I give you in the example from the health sector. Once you've got the weights, the third step is to focus and agree on deviations from the target. They are called criteria values, and there's a difference between criterion and criteria values. Criterion is like miles per gallon. So I can say that the way to evaluate any motor vehicle is miles per gallon. But what constitutes excellence and what constitutes average and poor depends on miles per gallon. And that would depend on whether you're talking about a truck or a car or a scooter. 10 miles per gallon may be excellent for a large truck, but it may be terrible for a scooter. So those levels of criterion which distinguish excellent from very good and poor are called criteria value. One can use a 7-point scale, a 5-point scale, a 3-point scale, but there must be a scaled concept. That is the innovation. Countries, governments that use single-point targets have not succeeded. And that's the old methodology. The new current best practice is that you must agree on a range of deviations. So at the end of the year, no one has to make a subjective decision. They don't have to say, well, this is close enough or it's acceptable. You've already agreed precisely how you will be judged at the end of the year. And so that's the third step. The fourth step we take at the end of the year, when we look at the achievements during the year, and then we figure out what needs to be done. So now let's look at the fourth step, which is at the end of the year. So for the first criterion, which is percentage increase in number of primary healthcare centers, let's say your achievement is 15. Now that's in between 70 and 80. And if you do interpolation, it's actually right in the middle, so you'll give 75. Now that 75 is called the raw score. And similarly for the second criteria, 18, the achievement at the end of the year is exactly under 90, so you give it 90. The last one is really achieves everything more than the excellent, so the maximum you can give is excellent, so you give it 100. But you can't add these raw scores because they have different priorities, different weights attached to them. Therefore, the logical thing is to multiply them by the weights. So 75 multiplied by 0.5 gives you 37.5. Similarly, 90 multiplied by 0.3 gives you 27. And the last one is clearly 20% because you've achieved everything. And when you add them up, you get 84.5%. Now this is a very critical number, the 84.5, because you have now created a bottom line for the government, which never existed. This is now called the composite score. And the first use of this was by Professor Leroy P. Jones, my teacher, my guru, who in Korea, in South Korea, when working on the reform of the public sector, started using this word. He created this bottom line for public enterprises. And from that point, it has now been used for government in many, many countries. And we will talk about that. But this is the composite score. This composite score is very important. So let me take a moment to make sure that we understand its significance. Composite score, for the first time, you're seeing right in front of your eyes the bottom line for the government being created. This is the bottom line. So when you have to judge whether countries are doing a good job at evaluation or not, you have to ask yourselves, are they creating this composite score? You can call it by any other name. It can be called a performance index or a weighted score. Name doesn't matter, but the methodology matters. Did they take these 4 steps to come to this conclusion? All things said, what is the government performance? And how are we to interpret 84.5? What it really means in common sense terms is that if everything had been done, you would get 100. If nothing had been done, you would get 0. So 84.5 simply means that the government department has achieved 84.5% of the promises it made. So it is really a measure between promise and delivery. If 100 is the promise, then 84.5 is the delivery. And that is the significance, the importance, and you will see ultimately the critical role it plays in government performance management. Now, let me end this session by giving you an example. We will revisit all these concepts in greater detail. This is just to give you a sense of where we are going. And you may be thinking this is some kind of a theoretical, unrealistic concept of bottom line. But I assure you, this is now the standard practice. Lots of countries are using it, including India used it for 5 years. And here is a report from one of the leading news channels in India called NDTV, and you have a look.
It's time for ministers in the central government to know how they did in this last year.
The government's report card is out, and it's time to meet the toppers and find out who didn't quite make the cut.
It's time for the Minister's report cards. Performance reports of 74 government departments is ready to be presented to Cabinet. NDTV has learned that the Cabinet Secretariat wants the top ministries to be awarded, but not everyone is happy with this, since in the long run, budgetary allocations will be decided by these performance reports. Have a look at the top performance in 2009-2010, the confidential list with NDTV now. These ministries topped with more than 90% marks. The School Education Department of HRD, the Information Technology and Post Department of the Ministry of Communications, Biotechnology Department of the Science and Technology Ministry, Ministry of Steel and Ministry of Corporate Affairs. However, ministries like the Information and Broadcasting Ministry did not do well with only 60% marks.
I'm happy that the ministries has performed well. We live in a democracy, so if there is ever a praise or a criticism of a certain aspect of a policy, we should be able to tweak it depending on the expectations and the aspirations of the people that we're working for.
The ministries are judged by the Cabinet Secretariat, the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry, and it's a tough exam. Ministries getting less than 60% are classified as having fared poorly, and you have to get more than 90% to be classified very good and excellent. Critics say those who did well set themselves very low targets. For instance, they got higher marks for spending more money instead of the quality of their schemes which were implemented. The toppers, of course, feel this is right.
Ministry of Corporate Affairs is one ministry, where a lot of improvements have been done. If the e-governance is perfect here.
For a long time, public perception of the government used to be limited to landmarks like this, the Shastri Bhavan. But now we can have a more tangible sort of figuring out which department in Shastri Bhavan gets how much marks. Of course, whether those marks are made public or not is going to be decided by the Prime Minister within the next few days. In New Delhi, Sunetra Chaudhary for NDTV.
So, what did you notice? What you noticed was that Government of India for 5 years was using the composite score as the bottom line for government departments, and it created a benchmark competition. Sometimes people said, how can you compare the composite score of education with health? You're not comparing education with health. What you're comparing is the ability of the two departments to deliver on the promises. Health is very different from education. Like in the university, we have history gold, someone who gets a full A in history, someone who gets a full A in geography and English literature. All A's are considered at the top of their game. What it means, or in many universities, you have a gold medalist. You can have a gold medalist in chemistry, you can have a gold medalist in physics. It doesn't mean physics and chemistry are the same just because you have a gold medal for both of them. What it means is that the person who got the gold medal is on the top of his game in chemistry, and the person who got a gold medal in physics is on the top of the game in physics. To that extent, they can be compared. Well, so you've seen that unlike the private sector, public sector has a bottom line. It's not profit, but there is a bottom line, and it's possible to create the bottom line. And this really was the central point of this session, that how to get to a meaningful bottom line for the public sector. And if we accept this as a generally accepted performance principle, then we will begin to have a methodology which can be compared across countries, across government departments, because this methodology is transcendental in its application. And then the next few sessions we'll go into greater details, and we will look at the application of this in various countries, and we'll find what happens if the country does not reach this point. So this really becomes the gold standard for judging the countries, and that we will do in the future sessions. Until then, thank you for being with us, and goodbye.